Thus, what belongs to the element of picture thinking, that is, that absolute spirit qua individual, or rather qua particular spirit, presents the nature of spirit in its natural existence, is here shifted into self-consciousness itself, into knowledge that preserves itself in its otherness. This self-consciousness, therefore, does not actually die as the particular self-consciousness is pictured as being actually dead, but its particularity dies away in its universality, that is, in its knowledge, which is essentially being reconciling itself with itself. The immediately preceding element of picture thinking is therefore here explicitly set aside, or it has returned into the self, into its notion. What was in the former merely in the element of being has become a subject. By this very fact, the first element to pure thinking and the eternal spirit therein is no longer beyond the picturing consciousness or beyond the self. On the contrary, the return into itself of the whole is just this, to contain within itself all the moments. The death of the mediator as grasped by the self is the supersession of his objective existence or his particular being for self. This particular being for self has become a universal self-consciousness. On the other side, the universal has become self-consciousness just because of this, and the pure or non-actual spirit of mere thinking has become actual. The death of the mediator is the death not only of his natural aspect or of his particular being for self, not only of the already dead husk stripped of its essential being, but also of the abstraction of the divine being. For the mediator, insofar as his death has not yet completed the reconciliation, is the one-sidedness which takes as essential being the simple element of thought in contrast to actuality. This one-sided extreme of the self does not as yet have equal worth with essential being. This it first has as spirit. The death of this picture thought contains, therefore, at the same time, the death of the abstraction of the divine being, which is not posited as self. That death is the painful feeling of the unhappy consciousness that God himself is dead. This hard saying is the expression of innermost simple self-knowledge, the return of consciousness into the depths of the night in which I equals I, a night which no longer distinguishes or knows anything outside of it. The feeling is, in fact, the loss of substance and of its appearance over against consciousness. But it is at the same time the pure subjectivity of substance, or the pure certainty of itself which it lacked when it was object, or the immediate or pure essence. This knowing is the inbreathing of the spirit, whereby substance becomes subject, by which its abstraction and lifelessness have died, and substance therefore has become actual and simple and universal self-consciousness. Getting close to the end of the religion section and ready to step across the threshold into the final section of Hegel's Phenomenology, we have this very fascinating paragraph 785, which is focused on the death of the mediator and the implications that we can draw out of it at this point, not just for all these great metaphysical things like substance and subject and self and self-consciousness, which are quite important, but also for, we could call it the medium, and it is indeed a medium that we use, of representation or picture thinking or imagination, of Vorstellung. And what we see here is not just a reconciliation that is taking place for spirit in the death of the mediator, which turns out not to be complete death, let's say, but a recuperation of picture thinking. It's not being thrown completely away. And if we jump ahead just a little bit, right, we have this very interesting passage. By this very fact, the first element to pure thinking and the eternal spirit therein, which is what we want, right? That's the good stuff, is no longer beyond the picturing consciousness, the consciousness that works through the medium of representation that you could say confines itself to that doesn't suspect that there's an entire range of better thinking beyond the merely pictured or represented, right? So it's no longer beyond the picturing consciousness or beyond the self. And now notice this incredibly important line here. On the contrary, the return into itself of the whole is just this, to contain within itself all of the moments. This is, you could say, one of the undergirding concepts running throughout all of Hegel's philosophy, and in particular the phenomenology, where we're making all these gestures and efforts and work trying, and it's not quite a linear process either. It's more of a zigzag process, you could say, to try to attain this understanding. I was almost tempted to say picture of, but that would be representation again, wouldn't it? An understanding, a comprehension of the whole, of the totality, the Ganz, right? The everything that alone allows everything to be placed into its proper, not just place, but perspective and function, you could say. So that's a lot of preface there. Let's jump now into looking at it from the very beginning. So he says, what belongs to the element of picture thinking, namely that absolute spirit qua individual, or rather qua particular spirit, right? So we've got absolute spirit, and then it is being presented, put forward, postulated, however you want to say it, as a particular individual. Who is the particular individual? Well, this guy who's going to die, the incarnate God, the God that has become not just enfleshed, but has become human, right? So he says, it presents the nature of spirit in its existence. So what belongs to the element of picture thinking, presents the nature of spirit in its natural existence, is here shifted into self-consciousness itself, into knowledge that preserves itself in its otherness. So self-consciousness, as we've seen many, many times in this section, also back in the self-consciousness section, also in the spirit section in particular, self-consciousness is only self-consciousness in relation to an other, or rather an entire world of others, right? Self-consciousness is not a stable being in and of itself. It is for itself and for others as well. And we've seen that this is taking place in the community, right? So he says, the self-consciousness, therefore, does not actually die as the particular self-consciousness is pictured, represented as being actually dead. So now we've got sort of an allegorizing here, right? So, but interestingly, usually when we talk about allegory, we mean a story that's actually telling another story, and those could both be on the level of Vorstellung, right? But this is telling us about something both metaphysical and moral at the same time, about the nature of humanity and its history. And so what do we actually have going on here? He says that the self-consciousness does not actually die as a particular self-consciousness is represented as being actually dead, but its particularity dies away in its universality. So in a certain sense, I mean, you might be a little bit worried about that. You might be like, well, I don't want to lose my particularity in universality, right? I want to remain me, right? And the good news is, well, you don't have to, because this guy, Jesus, already did that, right? he, as God, took on this particularity of human flesh and was killed, in fact, you could say, destroyed, wiped off the earth. I mean, of course, there's a body left behind, but in the resurrection story, no body to be found, right? And because that person was willing to be completely absorbed, for Hegelian ideas, into this universality, or become this universality, we get to do that in ways that preserve some of the moments of our individuality, our particularity. So the particularity dies away in its universality. And what is that universality? In its knowledge, which is essential being reconciling itself with itself. So one of the things that we can realize is that this Jesus Christ figure comes back as God, comes back to God, comes back within God as the universal in a different way, right? And that opens up a possibility for all of us to find our own more limited places within this economy of the universal, you could say. So he goes on and he tells us the immediately preceding element of picture thinking, therefore, here explicitly set aside, or it is returned into the self, into its notion, right? So picture thinking hasn't been like thrown away, gotten rid of entirely. It's going to be brought into a better perspective. And, he's going to talk about this. Miller's going to translate it as supersession, Aufheben, in just a bit. Well, this is one of those key Hegelian concepts, Aufhebung or Aufheben. Heben is, of course, the verb, right? Hebung is the sort of substantive of that verb. To supersede, to transcend, to incorporate while throwing away the inessential elements, to bring into a larger matrix of meaning. Well, that is what is going on here. A supersession of what? Of picture. And notice I put this in a little, cutesy way that's so common with continental thought in the late 20th century. It's not just picture thinking, it's pictured thinking, and that's part of the problem with Vorstellung, right? It is pictured, it is produced, it is turned into something that we can all look at and be, oh, the objectivity right there, right? Something that presents itself to us. We like that, but it doesn't adequately communicate the notion, the concept, the Begriff, the living thought that it is that we're after at this point in time. Living thought, not just in an abstract way, but living thought as oriented around what is most important in not just our own individual lives, but in the history of human consciousness. Now, we could quibble and say, Hegel, product of a Eurocentric Christian culture that thought that, the Christian story is the most important. And maybe there's some truth to that, but we don't have to worry about that at this point. More important is figuring out what is Hegel actually saying here, and then we can think about implications for world religions at some other time, or a broader, conceptual approach to this sort of thing in the 21st century. It's enough just to figure out what Hegel's doing here in the early 1800s. And so anyway, he says this immediately preceding element of picture thinking is returned into itself, into its notion. And what does this mean? What was in the former merely in the element of being has become a subject. This is not an idea that we haven't encountered before, right? Self, substance, spirit, subject, all these four S's. I mean, this has been an important theme really since the preface, and then took on a really important role in the spirit section and in the religion section. But we want to think about this for a moment. What does it mean to be a subject? It means having agency. It means having a certain capacity, not just to act on other things, but upon oneself, to get to know oneself, to decide about oneself, to be a subject. This is a bit of a digression here. To be a subject, unless we're talking about the absolute subject at the absolute end of history, is inherently paradoxical, perhaps even, in a Hegelian sense, contradictory, right? There are going to be contradictions, which might be just at the level of things that are set in opposition and Gegengestände, right? Which we sometimes translate as antithesis or opposed, right? It might be an actual contradiction, a Gegensatz, right? Where there's a genuine contradiction there. And what's really interesting about the Hegelian approach is when we hit a contradiction, we're not like, oh, well, contradiction, therefore we're finished. No. Some contradictions can be worked through. And the contradiction of being a subject, the contradiction involved in being a subject, is continually worked through, at least in implicit ways. And here it's being worked through in an explicit way, one that involves mediation and death. So he goes on and he says, by this very fact, the first element, too, pure thinking and the eternal spirit therein, is no longer beyond the picturing consciousness. On the contrary, the return into itself of the whole is just this, to contain within itself all the moments. This passage we started with, what are all the moments? A lot of them are, in fact, picture thinking, right? So we're not throwing it all away. We're figuring out how they connect with each other, what they actually mean. And here he's going to talk about the mediator, the Mittler, right? And this is, quite important. Mediation is absolutely central in Hegelian dialectics, realizing what's mediating what. In this case, we have a mediator who is mediating for himself or itself, two different sides, the God-man, right? But is also offering us the possibility of mediation as well. So he says the death of the mediator as grasped by the self is the supersession, right? There we've got the Aufheben of his objective existence, right? And that's Gegenständlichkeit. There's no Dasein in there. So Miller's translation, a little bit misleading perhaps. Gegenständlichkeit, the being an object that we can encounter, right? So, think about how the disciples encountered Christ. There were some suspicions that he indeed was God, but it's mostly like, wow, this guy gave us some fish and some wine and some teachings, and wow, this is a great person to be around, right? So the death of the mediator is the supersession of his objective existence or his particular being for self. Right? Besondere für sich sein. It's a person there, not just an object. And it's particular. And he goes on, he says, this particular being for self has become a universal self-consciousness. Christ becomes the Christian community, but is also God, right? On the other side, he says, the universal has become, werden is the word that he's using there, has become self-consciousness, right? Allgemeines Selbstbewusstsein is what we're dealing with here. Just because of this and the pure or non-actual spirit of mere thinking has become actual. Another very important Hegelian idea, right? Thinking, awesome, great, wonderful, we want to be thinking, right? But mere thinking by itself that doesn't become actual, doesn't become wirklich, real in the world, translated into action or comportment, it's just mere thinking, right? So this is the universal particularizing itself in a way, right, by becoming actual. So he says, the death of the mediator is the death not only of his natural aspect or of his particular being for self, not only of the already dead husk stripped of its essential being, the corpus, the body, if you think about a crucifix, it's kind of funny if you think about it. Christians have long since had depictions of the dead Christ. And it comes in a couple different forms, right? You've got him hanging there on the cross, and there's kind of an ambiguity. Is it supposed to be representing, picturing a still living, tortured, and dying man-God? Or does it depict the dead man-God who has expired along with the two thieves on the cross at Calvary? We could also say similar things about artistic representations like the Pietas showing, Mary cradling her dead son, right? Now his mission over. There's definitely a depiction of the dead thing, the husk there, right? That's perhaps what Hegel is referring to, the already dead husk stripped of his essential being. It's not just the individual who is dying, but, Hegel goes on, also the abstraction of the divine being, right? He says, for the mediator, insofar as his death has not yet completed the reconciliation, is the one-sidedness which takes as essential being the simple element of thought in contrast to actuality. So neither side really ought to have priority. There is a tendency, as Hegel's going to point out, to accord too great a weight to the side of the universal as opposed to the individual. And he goes on and he says, this one-sided extreme of the self does not yet have equal worth with essential being. This, at first, has as spirit. What is this? The equal worth, right? It attains it. So he goes on and he says, the death of this picture thought contains, therefore, at the same time, the death of the abstraction of the divine being, which is not posited as self. So, two sides are being revealed as inadequate, as not the full story here. The side of objective existence, the particular being for self, the side of the abstraction of divine being, not posited as self. It's got to be transformed into universal self-consciousness within the community through the mediator. And how is this going to happen? Well, he tells us, and here he's making a reference back to an earlier part of the phenomenology at the very end of the self-consciousness section. Actually, I shouldn't say at the very end because it's the longest part of the self-consciousness section, the unhappy consciousness, right? The spirit as human beings extending their ideas out into a beyond which they try to map onto, to meet up with through all sorts of efforts and continually fail in the process. In that, he actually, so this is one of the key phrases that comes up, he says, the death of the picture thought contains at the same time the death of the abstraction of the divine being, not posited as self, the self that's seeking it. That death is the painful feeling of the unhappy consciousness. What feeling? Not just a thought, but a feeling that God himself is dead. Gestorben ist. And it's kind of funny here, a little bit of word play. It's not just that God is dead, God is tot, right? God is gestorben, right? God has died. God is a dead thing, a thing that has died. If we want to unpack the language a little bit here and play around with it, getting away from the idiomatic use and looking at the pure lexicality of it. Now, Hegel goes on and he says, this hard saying is the expression of innermost, simple self-knowledge, the return of consciousness into the depths of the night in which I equals I A night which no longer distinguishes or knows anything outside of it. Well, that doesn't sound good. That sounds like we, had this big arc. Oh, we're getting closer and closer to reconciliation of everything and great Aufhebung and everything being connected in a whole. And boom, we go down into a lack of distinction. The proverbial night in which all cows are black, a pure identity statement of I equals I, something we can't do anything with, right? So that is the death that we're staring in the face, not just this guy hanging on the cross who sacrificed himself in this long narrative about God and propitiation and atonement and et cetera, right? This is something metaphysical. And he says that there's a feeling here. The feeling is, in fact, the loss of substance and its appearance over against consciousness. Now, the word here that's being translated as appearance, gegenübertretens, coming out to it. So appearing works, but it's rather something that is actually exercising some opposition to the consciousness, right? Gegen, Bewusstsein, is the over against consciousness. So the loss of substance over against consciousness, we lose our grasp on the thread of substance. But then he says, or the pure certainty of itself which it lacked when it was object, or the immediate or pure essence. So all of those are rolled into this loss of substance, which now becomes something different. And then he brings up something really interesting. This knowing is here's the translation, right? The inbreathing of spirit, right? Which is Begeisterung, becoming spirit. The knowing is the inbreathing of the spirit, whereby, and here we get these, massively important terms, and we get a metaphysical interpretation. Substance becomes subject and self-consciousness. What Hegel actually says, whereby, in this spiritualization, substance becomes subject, by which its abstraction and lifelessness have died. So, subject is living subject, right? Substance becomes something living, something agental, something that can do things, something that has desires, something that has movement, and, he goes on, and by which its abstraction and lifelessness have died. Substance, therefore, has become, notice these three qualifying terms, actual and simple and universal self-consciousness. Now, where are we going to find that? Well, universal self-consciousness, we know, is the religious community, right? It's been called that now for paragraph after paragraph. Actual, wirklich, in the world, existing, incorporating objective existences, particular individual beings for self, right? Uniting them into the community. And simple, einfach, right? That's also important. Simplicity out of plurality, we could say, by focusing, by engaging in this supersession. So we have a ton of stuff going on here, including Hegel's, we might say, practically definitive interpretation of what the death of the mediator Christ should actually mean for us.